Okay, let's begin then. So, for those that don't know me, my name is Ian Maloney. I'm originally from Scotland, but I've been in Japan since about 2005. Well, since 2005, not about 2005. Living in Tokai the whole time around Aichi and Gifu Prefecture. As a writer, I've written three novels. They're called First Time Solo, Selma Hill, and The Waves Burn Bright. I've written a collection of poetry called Fractures, and most recently, I've written a memoir about my life in Japan called The Only Gaijin in the Village, which was published in March of this year, but not according to Amazon Japan, because for some reason it was released and they've recently pulled it and unpublished it, and it now says to be released next month. Why? Who knows? Amazon will not reply to tweets or emails or anything. So, but yeah, it is out and available. The book is about, as I say, it's about my life in Japan, but not all of it. In 2016, my wife and I moved right into the countryside in rural Gifu, where into a little village where, as the title suggests rather strongly, I'm the only foreigner living there. In fact, the majority of people around here are retired couples whose children have moved elsewhere. It's the standard story of villages in Japan where the younger generation leave and don't come back. So I'll talk a little bit about how the book started, why I wrote it, and then I'll get into a bit of technical detail about the technical side, the art, I suppose, of taking real life events and turning it into creative nonfiction, into narrative, because it was a bit of a journey for me. As I said, I started off as a novelist and then moved into this. So the whole thing kind of started off, as I say, in 2016, we moved out here. And after about a year, at the start of about 2017, a guy I know called Jeff, who I knew through writing for Metropolis magazine in Tokyo, he got a job as the editor-in-chief, I think his title was, at Gaijin Pop. And he sent out an email saying, I'm in charge now, we're revamping things. Does anybody have anything they want to write about? This is kind of very much what Bob was talking about in the last one, about getting yourself out there. I'd published 3 novels. I'd written 5 novels, 2 of which are unpublishable garbage that nobody will ever see. And I was looking around for something new to do, a new way of writing, a new idea. I wasn't sure what, but I felt like I'd reached a conclusion, a sort of end of a stage, and I wanted something new to do. Around the same time that Jeff sent this email saying, hey, who wants to do what? I didn't want to do kind of straight travel writing, which I'd done quite a lot before. I visited this castle and here's a bit of history and here's some facts about it. I'd done a lot of that and didn't want to do any more, but I knew I wanted to do something sort of non-fiction. I wanted to try and write about life and experience. So I pitched him 2 ideas. One was writing about Japanese literature and introducing that to people who haven't read much Japanese literature, which I did and is still up there. And my other idea was I was having these weird experiences. I'd been in Japan for 11 years at that point, or 12 years, and I was having experiences that I'd never had before, and I hadn't read much about. There's a lot of books out there about my year in Japan kind of books, but the majority of them are written by sort of 22, 23-year-olds. They come here, graduate university, come here and have a year of young person craziness in Tokyo, where it's all kanji and karaoke and sushi and wild times and nomi hodais, lots and lots and lots of nomi hodais. And I'm too old for that stuff anymore. I'm past it. There's a lot of those books, but there aren't many books about what it's like settling down in Japan and starting a family in Japan or buying a house in Japan. And there's certainly very few books about not living in Tokyo or in Osaka or in the big areas. There's few books about living in the Japanese countryside. There are some books, some very good ones, but I hadn't read much about that and thought it would be good to explore that. So I pitched to Gaijin Pot the idea of doing a column about my life in the countryside and the experiences I was having. And this is where it gets technical. I use the word column, and I mean column specifically, specifically as opposed to writing a blog. I don't like the word blog, not because of a snobbish thing about diaries and things, but because it's a vague term. It's not a form. When the word blog was first used, it was just a kind of diary. People would write stuff and post it online. Anything from, this is what I've had for dinner, to sort of more emotional, heartfelt things. These days, the word blog has come to mean sort of any opinion piece that's posted online in any form whatsoever. That could still be someone just first draft ranting through their keyboard, or newspapers have blogs where people write things. I grew up in the 90s. I was a student in the 90s, and in Britain at that time, the newspaper column was still a very, very big thing, and columnists at the time became not wildly famous, but they were names. There was some, especially the ones who wrote about their lives meeting celebrities, became sort of household names. But the columns, those columns were sort of a big part of the newspaper world, I guess. And I certainly spent a long time. Every week you would read the same columnist and you'd enjoy their work. And the one thing I liked more than any other about the idea of the column is the structure of it, the form, the sort of technical literary form of the newspaper column as it was, which, again, I think with the idea of blogs, I think we've lost to a certain extent. The blog form, for me, can be boiled down to 3 or 4 specific things. First of all, the column is structured around a scene, one scene, I've sort of vignette from life. In the old days of stand-up, it would have been a funny thing happened on the way to the office or on the way to the theatre. So the column is structured around that one specific event that has happened. The event is then, and this is the second part, the event is then extrapolated into having sort of wider, more universal significance. You take one small event and in some cases blow it wildly out of proportion. If there's anyone from Britain here, you might be aware of on Radio 4, they have a program called Thought for the Day, where religious leaders from around the country are brought on, and they take some small item of news from the day and extrapolate from this into some bigger, more spiritual theme, which is then made fun of by satirists, because the way they managed to crowbar Jesus into whatever news story happens to be happening that day. The pound has plummeted today, and that reminds me of Jesus. And then they go on. So that's sort of taking a small thing and extrapolating it, often in a ridiculous way. The other thing I really loved about these columns was the way that the writers would never specifically write about themselves. I mean, there would be events in their own lives, but there was never a biography. There was never an explanation of, here, meet my children, meet my wife, meet my husband, whatever it would be. But over the series of these columns, and they were all maybe only 300-400 words long, over the length of these columns, over the run of them, you would start to build up a strong picture of the writer, just through incidental details, things mentioned. You'd learn about how they commute to work, because they'll say, like, I saw such and such out of the bus window, that kind of thing. All these little incidental details that would build up into this picture of another life. I love that. And coming at it later as somebody who wanted to write them, the fourth sort of part of my list is the technical shape of it. So the narrative arc, as I said at the start, is one vignette from life, but it's structured, it's deliberately structured in the way that a story is, with a beginning and a middle and an end, and has closure. Again, even if it's only in 300 words, it has a perfect shape of like an anecdote or a joke, a dinner party story, something like that. So that was kind of where I was coming from and what I wanted to do. I loved these old columns, and I wanted to try my hand at doing that, taking a vignette from life, using it as a springboard to extrapolate into something bigger, um, using it as a way to talk about myself without directly talking about myself, the sort of incidental details, but to do it in this beautiful, to me, beautiful literary form with a perfect narrative arc, even within it. So that's what happened. I started doing some of those articles, and I suppose the best way to explain or to elucidate what I'm talking about is to read you a small section from the book to show sort of what I mean by all four of those things coming together. So I'm going to read you very briefly the opening chapter, or the opening section of the opening chapter from the Only Gaijin in the Village. This is called "Yes, I Am a Long Way from Home." I'm going to die in Japan. At least that's the plan. Plan is the wrong word. I've not sat down like Wile E. Coyote, gripped by a wave of self-destruction, and plotted my own demise, strung an anvil from the roof, or painted a tunnel on the garage door. Nor am I predicting that a North Korean missile will take me out anytime soon, though that is certainly more likely. I have the experience to prove it. It was the 29th of August, 2017. I was camping in Aomori, the most northerly prefecture on Honshu, Japan's main island. Over the water is Hokkaido, the last prefecture before Russia, then a string of disputed islands and ice. During the summer vacation, I'd thrown the camping gear in the back of the car, caught up in a surge of wild man envy. I needed masculine exploits and rugged scenery. By the time I'd reached Aomori, I'd already been stung 36 times by bees, developed a fever as a result, been chased by a biker gang, and run away from a hotel before they discovered that when my fever broke, I'd sweated so much I'd turned their comfortable mattress into a waterbed. I'd been traveling for 10 days, hadn't spoken to anyone for 3, and was beginning to crack up. I woke up about 4 a.m., packed up quickly, happy to have been undisturbed by bears, and pointed the car south. Mogwai soared from the open windows as I sped through the glorious forest roads, the kind Ian Banks called Great Wee Roads, with the sun rising behind me. I joined the highway a little before 6, my intention to go as far as Sendai, refuel, and take it from there. A night in the city or another campsite? Fresh sheets or the pleasure of a lakeside sunset? My phone, acting as sat-nav from the 100 yen holster I taped to the dashboard, started buzzing like 36 bees had got inside it, immediately followed by a screeching alarm, far louder than the ear-hurting stereo volume. It was the J alert. For those who don't know, J alert is a nationwide warning system designed with 2 functions. The first is to give people a few seconds notice in advance of an earthquake or other disaster. The second is to scare the living shit out of people. With a volume and tone similar to the howler letters in Harry Potter, think an air horn attached to a bullhorn being held down by someone intent on giving you a heart attack, the J alert has caused me to leap from bed in the small hours, stub a toe, crack a shin, hit my head, and fall to the floor in terror. This time, it caused me to swerve wildly into the outside lane. Luckily, the highway was empty. The alarm finished. I righted my direction and pulled back into the inside lane. Japanese highways are raised affairs, literal highways on massive concrete legs with high sides to keep the noise in. If there was a big earthquake, I wanted to be somewhere less flippable. I wanted to be on a Great Wee Road, ideally in Scotland. After the alarm, an electronic female voice announced in Japanese, "Missile launch! Missile launch!" What? Missile launch! Missile launch! I thought that's what you said. I pulled the phone from its slot and tried to read the alert in Japanese, in a tiny font, still doing about 100 kilometers per hour on the highway. Not bright, but, special circumstances. Missile launch, get to a safe place, find somewhere underground or go inside a strong building. I'm high in the air on a concrete strip. The next exit was 20 kilometers away. No further information from the J alert. I went on to Twitter. The alert was already trending, but every tweet was a variation of WTF. I phoned Minori, my wife. What? What's happening? I'm asleep. No, with the missile. What missile? The alert. Are you drunk? Put the news on and call me back. As I waited, I remembered that the day before, driving north, I had been stuck behind a convoy of military vehicles, trucks, jeeps, and something that looked so suspiciously like a rocket launcher that I took a photo. For about 30 minutes, I'd trailed this convoy. I'd assumed there was a base nearby, though the surprised expressions and pointed fingers of villagers made me suspect not. They'd turned off a few kilometers before my junction, and I'd thought no more about it. Now the presence of that rocket launcher seemed ominous. Did they know something? Hi, where are you? I'm on the highway in Aomori. What's going on? The TV says it's a test. North Korea? Of course, it flew over Hokkaido and landed in the sea. She had this tone like it was the most mundane thing in the world, like she was reciting the weather forecast or responding to me telling her about my day. So we're not at war? Not yet. What are your plans? I was going to go to Sendai. Now I'm not so sure. Okay, drive safe. Let me know if a war starts. Okay. As I drove south, I pondered my situation. If war did break out, what would I do? In many ways, I was already in the best place. I was in the middle of nowhere, or at least very close to it, with enough provisions to last a week, maybe two if I were careful. I had a car full of camping gear, water, food, fresh and dried, but I was a long way from home. What would I do? Should I make a dash for home or hole up in the forest and wait it out? Scenes from various post-apocalyptic films played out. Soon I was imagining a zombie infestation and making plans. By 10 a.m., I'd reached Sendai. I came off the highway and refueled. I was exhausted, stiff, itchy, and sore. And now Kim was lobbing missiles at me. The holiday was over. Time to go home. In 12 hours, I drove more than 1,000 kilometers, stopping at service stations for lunch and dinner. When I swung into the driveway, I felt all the tension seep away. I was home. So that's the opening of the book. As you can maybe hopefully see from that, it's got that one event, so just driving and the missile coming and that, extrapolated out to ideas about home and death and family and where that comes from with various other things thrown in. So I started writing, that was one of the columns, or it was expanded from one of the original columns. I started doing it in 2017 and I did one a month for a year. So 12 articles, they're all about 800 words each, which sounds great. Every semester I laugh at my students when they complain about having to write 2 500-word essays in 3.5 months. Thing is, turns out it's actually quite hard. 800 words a month in this form, I discovered was very, very difficult to do. It started to really freak me out. It started to get stressful. I started to worry that nothing funny had happened to me in the last few weeks and I had nothing to work on. And as a fiction writer initially, my brain just kept going, oh, you could do this, coming up with ideas. But of course, that's cheating. That's not taking something from real life and turning it into creative nonfiction. That is fiction. So being a good boy, I refused to do any of that sort of thing. But it was still getting difficult. And I sat down and thought about it at the time, and I sort of realized that the problem wasn't that nothing funny was happening to me or nothing interesting was happening to me. It was that life is the wrong shape. Life isn't story shaped. We've all told stories about something exciting or funny that's happened to us, got to the end of the story and received zero response from our listeners, and gone with that classic line of, "Oh well, I guess you had to be there." I guess you had to be there does not work if you're a creative nonfiction writer. Your job is to bridge that gap of them not being there. But that was the problem. Life isn't a narrative. We construct narratives about our lives. Our whole story of ourselves is a constructed narrative. Our lives themselves aren't structured that way. Things happen for no reason. Things drift in and out your life. People drift in and out your life. Anyone who's written fiction, if you ever had a character just drift in and out of a book, a novel, the way they do in real life, your editor would tell you to take them out. Life, apart from in the most basic chronological sense, doesn't have a beginning and a middle and an end. And this was the single most difficult thing. It took me a long time to get my head around this because, as I say, my background is in fiction as a writer, but also as an editor. So I work as a fiction editor. And one of my mantras when I'm editing is everything must be in service of the plot. Every word you put in a story, whether it's a short story or a novel, every word must in some way progress the plot, develop the plot, and move things along. If it doesn't do that, whether it's character building, world building, whatever it is, if it doesn't contribute to the development of the plot, then it's a cul-de-sac, it's a tangent, you take it out. And that's kind of how I think about fiction and how I thought about writing. So everything in my writing arsenal up to that point was focused on plot. And your life doesn't, or my life anyway, our lives don't have plot in that sense. And this is where to get back to the technical side, this is where the form of the column comes in. The modern column is derived from the essay form, the old form of the essay. And the master of the essay form was Montaigne, the French author Michel de Montaigne from the 16th century. Now, being a good academic researcher, I found a nice quote to explain why Montaigne is relevant. And as a bad academic researcher, it comes from Wikipedia. Which I tell my students never, ever, ever to do, but I'm going to do myself. Montaigne, in his essay forms, quote, Montaigne wrote in a rather crafted rhetoric designed to intrigue and involve the reader, sometimes appearing to move in a stream of thought from topic to topic. His arguments are often supported with quotations from ancient Greek, Latin, and Italian text. This new form of writing did not aim to educate or prove, rather, his essays were exploratory journeys. Okay, so the important parts here when you're talking about the column form, the structure of the column isn't plot derived, it is the stream of thought from topic to topic, often supported with quotations. They're not arguments in the way that an academic essay would be, they are exploratory journeys. And that's the trick. That's what I realized. It took me a long time to realize was doing. When we're talking about real life, not fiction, not constructed plots, when we're taking real life and making narratives out of it, it's not the event that matters. It's the tangents. It's those cul-de-sacs that matter. It's the world building. It's the character details that matter. No one reads a memoir to find out what happens at the end. If you go far enough through everyone's memoir, the ending is the same. Spoiler alert. We read memoirs, and we read travel memoirs in particular, just to see the world through someone else's eyes. Not to find out what happens next, but just to experience that world, that view, that journey, the way someone else does. And that's what the column should be doing. That's the aim. It's to go back to the quote, it's the stream of thought from topic to topic. in a very Joycean way, that idea of thoughts flitting around that make a person and make an individual and make their unique viewpoint. And that's what we, certainly in my opinion, that's what we read memoir about, to find out. We don't read it to learn what happens next. The details matter, as anyone who's ever been told a story by a child will know. If you're told a story that just goes, and then this, 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 it very, very, very quickly becomes boring. It's, as the comedian Frank Carson used to say, it's the way we tell them that matters. So, where was I? Yeah, so life doesn't work in column form. You have to take it and shape it. You have to deliberately manipulate the events into a structure. And sometimes one event, one thing that happens in your life, even if you think it's hilarious or exciting or dramatic or whatever, one thing is not enough to actually build a story, build a chapter. And sometimes we take 3 or 4 events and combine them together. The joy of that Montaigne essay style of jumping around seemingly at random, which it definitely isn't, but seemingly drawing things in an organic way, is that you can combine a few things that are not necessarily related and build them up, put them together, and hopefully make an impact. Again, probably the easiest way to illustrate this is with an example. So I'm going to read another short section from the book. This is a chapter called Coming Under Fire. Many rural communities are not covered by the main city fire brigade and have stations run by part-time volunteers. The word volunteer contains no connotation of free will. Every man, always men, of age has to be trained and do a couple of years' service. As reservists, they can always be called on. Minori's brother had to suffer through this. My village has a part-time fire station, but thus far, no one has mentioned volunteering to me. At one community association meeting, they had to appoint a fire safety officer. Another new resident, Kanehara-san, raised his hand. I'm a full-time firefighter. It would make sense for me to do it. Can you do it every year? Sure. And that was that. He's stuck with it. And I want to keep it that way. I don't want to be involved. Opt in or opt out. Both choices here have consequences. It's not just the time commitments and language barriers that deter me. For example, you're in a burning house looking for trapped people, and it takes you a few seconds to remember if Migi is left or right. Was that verb form an order, a suggestion, or a negative conjugation? Should I stop or definitely not stop? There are 2 other factors. One is fear. Fear based on a very real awareness of the job. My father spent 30 years in the fire brigade. I've heard the stories. As kids, we went to the open days and saw demonstrations of how to put out a burning tower block, a car in flames, a crashed helicopter. It gets inside your head and stays there. During our 2nd year here, a house in the neighboring village caught fire. We watched helpless, horrified, as flames twice the height of the pine trees raged in the night sky. I triple check the gas if the gas is off, that the kerosene for the stove and the petrol for the lawnmower are secure, fastened tight, locked safely away in the garage. I love my fire pit, but I saturate the ground around it in water before lighting anything. The hose is on standby, leaves cleared in a wide circle. So that's the first reason, perfectly rational fear of what fire is, what it can do. The second reason is less serious, less depressing, less terrifying, but no less important for all that. Embarrassment. When I moved to Japan in 2005, I was placed by my company in a town called Inuyama, about 30 minutes north of Nagoya on the Aichi-Gifu border. Inuyama is a sleepy commuter town with a long history and ambitions to be a big tourist destination. A favourite spot amongst us to drink was under the bridge across the Kiso River. A couple of 100 metres along from the castle and about 20 minutes from my flat, it was perfect. Wide terraced levels that had been built for the crowds who came every August for the fireworks festival, so we had spacious, clean seating. The bridge, a road and rail bridge, was high enough that it wasn't cramped, but low enough that it offered protection in the rain. It was perfect for all-night drinking and talking. No residents around, hidden from the road in case any cops wandered by. We spent many, many nights under that bridge, and quite a few days. My first encounter with Japanese firemen was under this bridge with John, a Scouser who taught at the same school. We'd have a few cans after work, some chat, a missed train, and suddenly it was an all-nighter. I was 25, and all-nighters were still something I could not only manage, but actively looked forward to. Today I take comfort in the knowledge that the last train is at 11 p.m, giving me a cast iron excuse to get home at a decent time. So one night we went all chili peppers under the bridge there. As the clock approached 1 and John and I still had enough carry out, there came a rip of sounds and flashing lights. Cops, quick, hide the booze and pretend to be the monolingual simpleton. But no, it was a fire engine, red in tooth and claw. It edged down the slipway and pulled to a halt before us. John and I remained where we were, wondering what we'd done and what was going to be done to us. The men got out and fussed around the truck. We began to suspect their presence had nothing to do with ours. In fact, they seemed not to even know we were there. They lined up, military style, to attention. Their leader barked a few orders and they set off at a march. At this point, John and I made our presence felt in the form of uproarious drunken laughter. The Japanese firemen had an entirely unique form of locomotion. He starts in a standing position before leaning forward as if bowing. When movement begins, the arms piston alongside, the shoulder blades jutting, the fists pumping downwards. The knees, meanwhile, are brought up sharply in turn to waist height, propelling the fireman forward. The overall effect is of a badly made but enthusiastic clockwork soldier taking off across the floor. It is hilarious, particularly when unleashed in the presence of unsuspecting drunks. Startled and perhaps embarrassed, the men came to a sloppy halt. The leader gave us a dirty look and called the men into line. He drilled them for about 20 minutes, after which they piled back into the truck to a round of applause and disappeared into the night. We later found out that one of the men, Hiro, was a friend of Kay's and drank in his bar. One day, a few months later, Kay's phone rang. It was Hiro. "Run outside the shop!" We obeyed. A fire truck, sirens and lights blazing, sped by. 2 firemen clung in position on the back. Well, one clung in position. The other was Hiro, fully kitted up, one arm and one leg in position, the other trailing behind the truck, star-shaped. This look of sheer joy on his chubby face as they roared by stays with me to this day. So, in terms of what I was talking about, there's a few different stories in there. The fire that happened nearby us, watching the firemen train under the bridge, seeing Hiro hanging off the back of a fire truck with glee. Each one of those is an interesting moment and hopefully an entertaining moment, but none of them are enough to build a chapter on, to build a story on. If I just told you the story of, well, for example, Hiro hanging off the back of a truck, it would be over in seconds and it would be rather unsatisfying. Insert joke here. So the column form means you take all those little bits in, you take the vignettes and you build them up, you pack them up on each other, and hopefully it builds and builds into something much better. Without that, without the shaping, it doesn't work. If you just structured things like, for example, in a chronological way, my book is called, the subtitle is A Year Living in Rural Japan, but it's not a year. It's, as you can see from that, one of those events happened in 2006, one happened in 2018. It jumps around, but it builds, they come together in that montane, jumping from thought to thought to thought as it goes on. It is manipulation, and I use the word manipulation deliberately because of its negative connotations. It raises a very, very important question, and one I struggled with when I was writing this, and one I discussed at length with my editor, is if you're shaping real events and turning them into stories, where is the line? How far can you go with that? Where is the line between nonfiction and fiction? When does it start to get dodgy? In my book, I changed the names of all my neighbors. Fine, that's done to protect their privacy. But it adds a certain small worrying bit of fictionalization, that these names are different and this is different. And the question we always have to ask as writers of creative nonfiction is, where is the line? Is nonfiction the same as fact? And I don't think it is. There is a difference. I'm reading a very interesting book at the moment by a guy called Dominic LaCapra, who's a historian, and he writes about the act of writing history. And for a historian, his argument, he starts off as, for a historian, you're not fictionalizing things. Your job is to report facts. This happened, these are the dates, these are the events, this is what happened. The problem with historiography, and it's a problem we encounter in creative nonfiction, is the second you begin using rhetoric, the second you begin using techniques and rhetorical devices, you're molding reality, you're spinning things in a certain way. So, for example, just to illustrate, the sentence "Malcolm X was born on May 19th, 1925" is just a statement of fact. There's no, and it is, I double checked, it's on Wikipedia. It is a statement of fact. But if you were to write it as, it was a warm early summer day in Omaha when Malcolm X came into the world, you're changing something, you're adding elements, you're adding rhetorical devices. And for LaCapra in his book, he starts to worry about where this takes you. Where is the line when you get off? Are you still writing history if you're writing sentences like, it was a warm early summer day in Omaha? I'm not going to pretend to have an answer to this. We're approaching the end. I don't have an answer for where the line between fiction and non-fiction is. But I think the answer to that is also the answer to, or a potential answer to, the idea of things like cultural appropriation, and whether writers can write from various different points of view that are not their own. And it's that everything comes down to honesty and respect. We are, in everything I've written in my book, I have to be able to say, this happened, these moments happened, these people are real, this happened. Otherwise, it is just fiction. It stops being creative nonfiction. But as readers, we're always aware that any writing, any kind of writing, is a form of artifice. Things are changed. And I think as long as you're honest and open and trust your readers and treat your readers with intelligence, then the art of shaping things into a specific literary form does not necessarily come into conflict with the idea of the difference between fiction and non-fiction. They're two sides of the same coin in a certain sense. It is difficult, though. It's very difficult. And it's something I've been talking about, this idea of shaping reality, and whether that's at what point nonfiction becomes fiction, from the point of view of someone writing nonfiction from my own life. It's also something I encountered previously in my last novel, The Waves Burn Bright, where I did sort of the flip side of that. I took an event, a very traumatic event in the real world, the Piper Alpha disaster, which, if anyone doesn't know, the Piper Alpha disaster was, Piper Alpha was an oil rig off the coast of Aberdeen. And in 1988, it burned. There was a huge fire, and 167 out of 226 people aboard that died. And I wrote a novel about it, a fully fictionalized novel. And I had to deal with very similar problems, which were that I was writing about an event where real people had died and real people had survived, and within living memory. It's 32 years ago. So the families of the survivors and of those who died are still living in Aberdeen. People are still there. And I was proposing, and this scared the hell out of me at the time, proposing taking from their real lives and crafting fiction, turning it into, in some senses, a form of entertainment. And it terrified me, and it took me a long time, much longer than with this book, to work out where I could manipulate reality, what I could shape, what can't be shaped. And in that one, I have to admit to being an absolute coward and completely copped out. And the way I dealt with it was by creating a new character. So there were originally 226 people on board Piper Alpha, and in my book there are 227. So I could create a character and put thoughts in his head and words in his mouth without ever stepping on anybody's toes. So it's a very, very difficult thing. It's something I found difficult and something I continue to find fascinating. I have recently started my PhD, which is on this subject. It's something I can't quite ever stop thinking about. Where is the line between fiction and non-fiction? How much manipulation of fact into narrative is acceptable, is non-acceptable, in which case, what is creative non-fiction? Is it even possible as a form? As I say, I don't know the answers to those questions. I just raised them. Talking of questions, we're running low on time, so I will end there. I will have a quick look at the chat. If you have any questions, as I am both host and presenter, feel free to just unmic yourself and call on me while I have a quick glance through the chat. Yeah, who's got a hand up? Alec, on you go.
Hi, Ian. Thanks very much. Very interesting. My question is, how much knowledge of Japan do you assume on the part of your readership?
That's a good question. That was a very difficult thing. And I have to say, this is the first time I've ever read any of it to an audience I would expect to have much knowledge of Japan. I tried to pitch it somewhere in the middle, that people who'd never been to Japan before could read it and get something out of it. So there are, the way it jumps around in that Montaigne-like sense, it goes back to my very first experiences of Japan, but then comes back up to
your collection. Will outside readers understand?
Sorry, I can't hear you. So yeah, but I also wanted to appeal, as I said at the start, there's a lot of books out there about people's first years in Japan, but not very many books about your 15th year in Japan or your 20th, 30th, 40th year in Japan. And I wanted to write a book that I would like to read as someone who does have, a few years experience in Japan. You'd have to ask readers whether I achieved that or not. I managed to get both sides of it, but yeah, that was the aim. Anyway.
Thank you.
Yeah, my name is David.
Hi.
Okay. Following on from Alex's question there. A few years ago, Hillel Wright, who often presented here and was very involved with JWC, he answered that question that Alec just asked by saying many years ago, you had to assume that people didn't know so much about Japan, so you had to put more in there. But now everybody can get on the internet at any time and see everything. And there's a much higher level of knowledge, so you don't have to put as much in now as previously you did.
Yeah, that's definitely true. I mean, one thing I really resisted was putting in too many explanations about words that cropped up. So if I meet a friend in an izakaya, I don't want to spend 3 sentences explaining what an izakaya is. Right. There is a glossary at the back of the book, but a lot of those are just kind of joke definitions of things, and a few things that people really, really need to know. Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. I think that's true of all writing these days, though. If somebody, if you're reading a book on a Kindle and you don't know a word, you can just press the button and it'll give you a definition, or you can go and Google and find out more. So in that sense, yeah, I absolutely agree. It's easier to leave things out these days. Yeah. So, Patrick.
Yeah, I once heard the author Isabel Allende. I don't know if you know her. She's lives in America, but she's a Chilean author, very well published in both English and Spanish. And once heard an interview with her, and she was talking about a lot of her writing she bases on certain experiences in her life. But she might take a certain event, like a little, if she's writing a romance thing or something, a little romance, and maybe it was a fun date, it started well, but it ended sadly. But she's like, it started so well, it seemed like a good story, so I had to put the fiction to finish it. So kind of her points were is that sometimes you got to mix them all together. Would you kind of agree with that, or what would your feelings be about that?
I would agree with that. I mean, it's definitely a gray area and a movable feast, but the problem comes with then how you publish and market it. Is it not creative nonfiction? Is it memoir? Is it a novel? I could just as easily have written a novel about a foreigner moving into the countryside in Japan and fictionalized it all. But at some point, you have to come down on one side or the other. Otherwise, Amazon won't stock it, and the bookshops won't know which department to put it in. It is an interesting question, though. It's something that's fascinated me since I started reading Japanese literature, and there are people here who are way better qualified to talk about this than me. But the idea of the I novel, where the authors deliberately take moments from their life and sort of half fictionalize it in a sense, and they're described semi-autobiographical novels and that kind of blurring of the boundaries. I think it's fascinating, and writers, I do think writers can kind of do anything they want, and you can mix reality and non-reality and do whatever. The problem, as I say, comes down to your publisher and your booksellers, and where do they put things. Got a couple of questions in the chat just quickly. Laura says, sounds like your book is a collection of columns with wonderful internal structure. How did you think about the larger thematic structure of the book? Yeah, it started off as columns, and the single worst thing was when the publisher took the book and said, right, great, there are 800-word columns, you have 12 of them, now we need 80,000 words. And I almost cried. Yeah, it doesn't work. The column structure doesn't work when you make it into a wider book. The columns are in there, but then you have to link things, you have to move around. And the thematic structure came later. I sort of had fragments and I had things I wanted to talk about, but the biggest sort of binding element of the entire book is my father-in-law. He became a major character in the book, which I hadn't intended at all. He was just mentioned in passing times. And as I wrote more and more, took more and more events, his character sort of developed and developed until he took over the book, which was delightful. It was wonderful. I hear other writers talk about, these happy accidents and go, when will my happy accident come? I want these things. And that was one. So yeah, it did that. Richard says, I enjoyed the humor and references in the book. How did you look after the tone from serious or comedic? Were you careful with references, too many or too obscure? References were policed by my editor, who would go, yeah, I have no idea what you're talking about. And I would explain the reference and then she'd go, yeah, still no, and take it out. So some did go, some stayed in that I was very surprised about. There's a weird reference to Smashing Pumpkins that I thought would be taken out and didn't. Serious and comedic was a bit more difficult. When I started writing the columns, I wanted to write comedy. I wanted this to be funny, the 800-word anecdote, basically. But I can't keep that up for 80,000 words. It's just too much. And so the more serious side came in. The strongest thing I learned I did English literature at university as an undergrad, and the one thing more than anything else that stuck in my head, apart from how quickly to down a pint, is the oh, what's he called? Is a doorkeeper? It's not like the doorman. The guy who I've forgotten the word. The guy who opens the door in Macbeth. There's a scene in Macbeth where there's drama, and then he goes to the door. Like somebody knocks on the door, goes to the door, and it's standard Shakespeare banter between a high person and a low person, Hamlet and alas poor Yorick, that kind of thing. And I just remember learning about this technique that Shakespeare used of you build the drama up to a certain point, you build the tension up, and then you throw in a joke. You throw in a funny scene that doesn't really matter. Thank you, Richard. The porter, that's what he's called. The porter, Macbeth. And you do that and you release the tension, but it also allows you to then build up an even higher level of tension. That's always in the back of my head when I'm structuring things, that idea of, okay, there's too much tension, it needs to be released, or this has been silly for too long, we need to make it serious, and sort of balance it out that way. Right, we're nearly out of time. There's one more question, chat. I'll quickly answer that, and then I will hand over to John, who's next. Ginny wants to know more about the wild boar. I really don't want to talk too much about the wild boar because that was gross. If you haven't read it, my father-in-law is something of a hunter and fisher, and he has cages up in the mountains to catch wild boar. And every once in a while, he needs a hand dealing with a wild boar. And yeah, I helped him out one time and never again. I'm not cut out for the picture. But yeah, that was horrific and delicious in about equal ways. So yeah, I will stop there. That's 2:52. Thank you all very much for listening. I'm sorry if I waffled too much. It's very difficult when you can't actually interact with an audience. But yeah, thank you all for stopping by. My book is available regardless of what Amazon Japan says. So please check it out. We'll have a short break just now, and then we will hand over to John, who is going to talk about, John Gribble, who's going to talk about the MFA, the good, bad, and the expensive. So please wait around for that.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you all for the nice comments in the chat as well.